My name is Max Chong.
And my name is Ryan Said Naveed. And welcome to What If?
Today is April 19th, 2023, and we are coming to you from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. We are excited to bring you this podcast as we will have a special guest speaker, Professor Lloyd Eby, who will join us later in this podcast.
We will dive into the fascinating world of moral philosophy and its application to modern-day scenarios. We recognize that moral philosophies like utilitarianism and Kantianism have their limitations in the context of moral relativism, where morality is subjective and dependent on individual perspectives. As a result, people often employ a hybrid form of opportunism in navigating different parts of their lives with different philosophies. We aim to shed light on the complexity of moral decision-making in our modern world, emphasizing the need for a nuanced approach to ethical dilemmas. In this episode, we will take a deep dive into the lens of moral philosophy, proving the concept of moral relativism.
Thanks, Ryan. So this podcast will be broken up into multiple parts. The intro, which is now, and then 5 conversations between Ryan and I. The first conversation will be defining utilitarianism and Kantianism. The second conversation will be defining morality and why it's subjective and why that's important. Our third conversation will be talking about defining moral relativism. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it needed? And how does that morality being subjective lead to moral relativism? And also consider the idea if it's important for our society. Our fourth conversation will be the limitations of Kantianism and utilitarianism in the context of moral relativism. And the fifth conversation will be putting it all together and coming up with our nuanced approach. Finally, we will conclude and wrap up key points from our podcast and interview and analyze them. We hope you'll join us for some thought-provoking discussions and engaging conversations as we apply various ethical frameworks to real-life scenarios. We're not just here to educate you. We're here to make you laugh, have fun while exploring the nuances of moral philosophy. So sit back, relax,
and let's dive into the world of ethics together.
Yo, what's up, guys? Welcome to the first episode of What If, and today me and Ryan here will be talking about 2 prominent ethical theories. So Ryan, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, so the 2 prominent ethical theories we will be talking about is utilitarianism and Kantianism. And we based our information on readings from Kant, Jeremy, Bentham, and Mill. And basically, utilitarianism and Kantianism are 2 ethical frameworks that offer different approaches to moral decision-making. So utilitarian comes from a consequentialist point of view that emphasizes maximizing overall happiness or pleasure and minimizing overall pain or suffering.
Yeah.
And this approach prioritizes the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And this approach weighs the potential consequences of an action in determining its morality. So in utilitarianism, the morality of an action is judged based on its outcomes rather than its intentions or the inherent nature of the action itself. So a quote from Bentham from an Introduction to Principles in Morals and Legislation, he stated that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong.
Yeah, thanks for that definition, Ryan. So Bentham was moreover focusing on the quantitative aspect of utilitarianism, right? While Mill was focusing on more so the quality. So I was wondering, as Bentham was kind of focusing on that quantitative aspect of utilitarianism and emphasizing the importance of, maximizing pleasure, where Mill was doing the opposite, focusing on the quality side. How do you necessarily differentiate the quality of pleasure and also differentiate the quantity as well as calculating the quantity?
So the difference between quantitative and qualitative is when it comes to qualitative, the pleasures of reading versus the pleasures of saving someone from dying. Those things rank differently.
Gotcha.
So Mill believed that intellectual pleasures like reading were of higher ranking than eating or drinking.
Okay.
Right? And Bentham argued in a quantitative sense where he used hedonic calculus to calculate that all pleasures are equal. And that's like really important. But I think both of them were great proponents to utilitarianism, and utilitarianism really talks about the outcome rather than the intention.
Yeah, that's a great segue towards what I wanted to talk about, which is Kantianism. You mentioned that intent's not really significant in utilitarianism. However, I'm sure in Kantianism, intent's actually a huge factor.
Yeah.
So before I go into that, I might as well just define Kantianism a little bit. Kantianism is a moral philosophy based on the ideas of the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kantianism is a branch of deontology, and they're not the same thing. And if our viewers don't know what deontology is, it's a broader ethical framework that encompasses various ethical theories, including Kantianism. So the word deon, which translates to what is right, is Greek. So what is right? Deontology focuses on the inherent rightness or wrongness of actions themselves, rather than the outcome or consequences of those actions. So that's the idea of intent, the rightness or wrongness of those actions. So Kant, he believed that moral principles could be derived from the use of reason alone, and you don't necessarily have to rely on religious or cultural traditions. He says that an action cannot be considered moral unless there is universal application of that law. And the main point is that you treat people as an ends themselves rather than a means to an ends. So, does that make sense?
No, that definitely makes sense. And I think I really like the categorical imperative and definitely try to apply it to my own life.
Yeah, no, the categorical imperative is really interesting and fascinating itself. It talks about how if one person does it, everyone is okay with it and everyone would do it. So what I thought was really cool was this quote from Kant, and it was from the Metaphysics of Morals. He says that knowledge of what is incumbent upon everyone to do, and so also to know what would be attainable by everyone, even the most ordinary human being. And that was on page 167, if you guys want to find that, if you're watching. So how I broke this quote down was 2 parts: universality and attainability. Kant further suggests that this knowledge of moral obligation should be attainable by everyone, including the most ordinary human being. This implies that moral principles and duties should be understandable and achievable by any rational individual, regardless of their intellectual capacity or social status. So he's basically saying that everyone can do this. And I think that kind of aligns with the categorical imperative in the sense that this concept is universally applicable, and the moral obligations with it, and the idea that everyone should have access to their moral duties. So Ryan, what are your thoughts?
So I think Kant really emphasized on universality in the categorical imperative, and I think the categorical imperative is a strong proponent of this ethical framework, because when I think about it, I really try not to treat people as means and only as ends, right? I think that should be universalized, or at least try to, but it's hard because morality is subjective. For instance, also a part of the categorical imperative states that always act in the maximum of everyone's actions. So basically, if I'm waiting in line at a coffee shop, right, and I feel like I want to cut the line. If I cut the line, then everyone cuts the line. And what happens to the line?
The line disappears.
Yeah, there would be no line. So I think that just shows how strong the categorical imperative is. But, this ties in, again, that there are different perspectives, there are different cultures, and there are different moral beliefs.
Yeah, exactly.
And morality is subjective.
So leewaying into morality being subjective, the question of what is morality, who defines that, and if there is a universal law of morality steps into play. There's factors such as cultural differences, role of emotions, and other factors that kind of influence what morality is.
Yeah.
An article by Lena Bentahila, Roger Fontaine, and Valerie Penquin titled Universality and Cultural Diversity in Moral Reasoning and Judgment highlight that morality is shaped by cultural factors, and that different cultures exhibit distinct patterns of moral cognition. They argue for, a pluralist understanding of morality rooted in human evolutionary history. However, they acknowledge that cultures vary significantly in their promotion and transmission of moral values due to historical, religious, and social influences. This is a quote from the article that says, depending on history, religious beliefs, social ecology, and institutional regulations, each society develops a moral system emphasizing several moral orientations.
Yeah, and I think that's just a really good quote and really good analysis. That morality is subjective. In my own beliefs, I'm raised under a religiously Muslim household, and maybe
exactly.
and I know you're raised in a Christian household.
Exactly.
So we have different
moral orientations.
Exactly, based on just different cultural, religious perspectives.
And talking about that, how each society develops a moral system emphasizing, several moral orientations. these societies can involve different beliefs and different emotions, and the idea of emotions play a crucial role in moral decision making, and they can influence how we perceive moral situations and how we make moral judgments. You could explore how different emotions such as anger, empathy, or guilt can impact moral decision making, and whether emotions can sometimes lead us astray from making rational and objective moral decisions. Kind of like following that, we talked about how we were raised in different households and different environments. My parents might have instilled different personal values from me, and your parents probably instilled different personal values from you, which can also influence how we make moral decisions.
Correct.
My parents could honor values such as honesty, loyalty, and compassion, and instill that into me, and this can impact how I make decisions throughout my life, while your parents could do the opposite. Not saying, but that's just something that I thought of.
Yeah.
And like through these personal values, they affect our emotions, because emotions definitely cloud our judgment. You ever get really mad at someone and go against your moral values?
Sometimes I just feel like sometimes if I'm walking and some guy maybe pushes me or something accidentally, sometimes I get so angry. I feel like I want to punch them.
And that could go against your moral values.
Yeah, that does,
So these emotions can definitely shape and affect the trajectory of how we perceive our moral values and what our ethics are.
Correct.
So, following that, if you're a person that values compassion, you prioritize the well-being of others, and you consider it more important than personal success or achievement. But in contrast, if you value, self-reliance, you might prioritize individual autonomy and independence. And we're kind of discussing how we often navigate different parts of, our lives with different, philosophies. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. This kind of results in that idea of following a nuanced approach,
I got you. And what we're arguing is that morality is subjective, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just us. For example, a 2014 Pew Research Center survey found that 56% of Americans believe that, quote, morals are relative to the individual and the situation, end quote.
And I guarantee that these people would agree with the idea of fluid morality.
100%. Well, for the listeners, what is fluid morality?
Yeah, fluid morality, it says it in its name. It's sort of the idea that your morals are fluid depending on the situation you're in. So, if something, a scenario pops up, like we talked about how our emotions can cloud our judgment, our morals and our values can adjust to different scenarios and situations.
Yeah, and adjusting to the circumstances, right?
Exactly, and it actually makes a lot of sense, because in some cases you want to do the moral thing. And in some cases you don't want to do the moral thing, and I think it completely aligns with the idea of moral subjectivity, because moral values are not fixed or absolute. They rather change and evolve over time in different contexts.
Exactly, and I believe that we have to accept that because of different cultural perspectives and individual perspectives.
Yeah, so that's actually a great point, because a pretty controversial take would be, what would you say to Hitler telling you that it's a part of his culture to enact genocide? Because we talk about, moral subjectivity having different cultural differences, and, Hitler could argue that my culture says this, and we have to agree with that.
Well,
we wouldn't,
and I'll explain why. So while moral subjectivity acknowledges that different cultures may have varying moral beliefs and practices, it does not necessarily mean that all moral judgments are equally valid or acceptable, right? So one can argue that there are objective moral principles or values that transcend cultural differences, such as the principle of respect for human life or the principle of minimizing harm to others, right? So for instance, a 2019 Gallup News poll found that 90% of Americans considered killing someone else as morally wrong. And that's just in America. But we can look at multiple and various other religions across the world, and you can clearly see that life is treated very heavily and it should not be killed or harmed.
Kind of going towards that. Another argument against that Hitler enacting in genocide and that murder is not okay. It goes against cultural relativism in the context that it's based on, the recognition of immense harm and suffering caused by genocide. Even within what we're arguing, a subjective moral framework, one can easily argue that the extensive suffering, inflicted upon individuals and communities outweighs any claims based on cultural relativism thus significant harm caused by genocide precludes strong reasons to reject Hitler's justification. It goes with the article that we talked about. Each society develops a moral system emphasizing several moral orientations. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And this ties into the concept of moral relativism.
So, what is moral relativism? Is it good or bad? Is it needed? How does it impact our society? As we're talking about how our ethical philosophies, Kantianism and utilitarianism, and how they factor in the limitations of them in the context of moral relativism, we first need to understand what it is. So moral relativism is the belief that moral judgments and values are subjective and vary across individuals, cultures, and historical contexts. Hence our approach on why morality is subjective. According to this perspective, there are no universally valid or objective moral standards, and what is considered morally right or wrong is contingent upon individual or cultural preferences and social norms, and more. In other words, moral relativism holds that moral truths are relative and not absolute, and moral judgments are dependent on personal and cultural beliefs. Moral relativism does not mean that there's one correct answer. There can be other correct answers. In this article published by the Cambridge University Press titled "What is Moral Relativism?", a quote from that is, it says, "Relativism is the view that there are two or more equally valid or true but conflicting moral codes. On the other hand, relativism contrasts with universalism, the view that there is a single true or valid moral code, binding on all people at all times." So this is kind of talking about the idea that relativism refers to the perspective that multiple moral codes can exist and each is considered valid or true. These moral codes may differ from one another and conflict, but that is okay.
And yeah, I think that moral relativism allows us to understand varying ethical theories across different cultures, but it's just that one can't be universalized, you know?
So if we decide to use utilitarianism in one sense, and we want to be able to diversify and use multiple ethical theories, that some people may want to just stick with utilitarianism or Kantianism, and that's okay.
That is completely okay, and I think moral relativism supports this belief. It's that we just understand that people often navigate different parts of their lives with different ethical theories. But now it raises a question.
Yeah.
Is it good for society?
Yeah, I think that's a really hard question, but in our case,
it would be
good for the society.
And I'll explain why. So it would avoid ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is basically the belief that a person's culture or a group is superior to others. But moral relativism challenges this claim by emphasizing that no single culture or set of values is inherently superior to others. By encouraging a more inclusive and open-minded approach, moral relativism can help reduce conflicts arising from cultural differences and promote peaceful coexistence.
Yeah, and following that, I think another thing we should focus on is that moral relativism opens up flexibility and adaptability.
Yeah.
You know, society is constantly evolving, and moral relativism allows for flexibility and adaptation to changing circumstances. You know, it's 2023. We have social media. We have cars. We have technology we didn't expect and we have never seen before. And with a rapid evolving society, new knowledge emerges, and societal values can be reevaluated and revised accordingly. And this adaptability enables societies to address emerging ethical issues such as these advances in technology or evolving social norms in a more inclusive and responsible manner.
Exactly. And moral relativism allows us to peacefully coexist with other cultures that may have differing technologies or differing views, different perspectives, etc.
It's like the idea, like, you want diversity, you want diverse opinions, you want different perspectives.
A broad range.
Like when you're working in a group project, wouldn't you say you want people that have 5 different majors rather than working on a project with everyone has the same major?
Yeah.
It constricts it, and it doesn't allow for other opinions or perspectives to arise.
That's true. And I think moral relativism also recognizes the importance of individual autonomy and personal choice. Because of moral relativism, it allows individuals to determine their own moral values within the framework of their own societal norms. So this freedom of choice can actually empower individuals. And I know it empowers me when I think that I don't necessarily have a universal moral code, but I'm allowed to peacefully coexist with society with my own moral code. And through this fosters a sense of ownership over their own moral decisions and promotes personal growth and self-actualization.
Yeah, for sure.
And although moral relativism can be seen as a negative
Yeah.
for our society,
I definitely
some ways,
I can see ways people
because it can make it harder to get to decisions. But could you not argue that it has allowed our society to be free and create a sense of diverse beliefs and abilities? This reminds me of a quote I read from Lawrence Michael Hinman, who is an American philosopher and professor at Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of San Diego. He states that moral relativism can help us recognize and appreciate the diversity of ethical views across different cultures and communities and promote greater tolerance and understanding among people with different moral beliefs. I think that quote is just an amazing description of moral relativism and how it builds diversity and therefore good for our society. Now that we define moral relativism, now we're going to look at the limitations of Kantianism and utilitarianism under this concept.
Yeah, so the first thing that me and Ryan can definitely agree on is the lack of cultural and contextual sensitivity.
Yeah.
Kantian ethics does not take into account the cultural and contextual differences that exist among different societies and individuals. A moral norm in one culture may not be viewed the same in another culture, and that the concept of universal moral duties may be culturally biased. So an example would be polygamy versus
monogamy.
Monogamy. Thank you.
Right.
The word was blanking for a second, but I know in the United States polygamy is banned in a lot of states, and I think most of the United States it's banned and considered immoral and not ethical. But in a lot of parts of Africa, I'm pretty sure it's West Africa and Central Africa, polygamy is very high. There's a very high prevalence of polygamy there.
Yeah, that's true. And but yeah, this just shows that how a moral norm in one culture won't be the same in other cultures.
Exactly.
And Kantianism also emphasizes the idea of universal moral duties. However, in some situations, these moral duties may conflict with each other, making it difficult to determine what is morally right or wrong. This is known as the problem of moral conflict. The problem of moral conflict arises when two or more moral duties or principles that an individual is obliged or obligated to follow are in conflict with each other. For instance, consider a situation where a person is promised to keep a secret but is also obligated to tell the truth. In this case, the moral duty to keep the promise conflicts with the moral duty to tell the truth.
It's like the example of class, like the thief,
Yeah.
Where the thief is trying to kill someone, and you could either tell the truth to abide by what the thief is asking you to do, or you could lie, which Kant says it is not ethical to lie.
Exactly. And I think that's a huge fallacy in Kant's argument, right? You brought up the thief argument. If a thief comes to your house and asks where your brother is, and you know where your brother is, and the thief has the intention to kill your brother, under Kant's philosophy, you cannot lie. Or if you do lie, that would be immoral. And that just shows how it's very challenging to apply this philosophy on a universal scale.
Overall, the problem of a moral conflict is a limitation of Kantianism in the context of moral relativism. It can be challenging to determine what is morally right or wrong when these duties conflict with each other.
Yeah, and so, this reminds me of an essay I read, Moral Philosophy by Fred Feldman, who's an American philosopher who specializes in ethical theory and a professor who has conducted research that primarily focuses on normative ethics. He states that Kantian ethics, with its emphasis on universality and impartiality, can be too demanding and impractical for everyday life, where we often have to make decisions based on personal relationships, emotions, and contextual factors. Max, what do you think about this quote?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely aligns with our argument in the sense that the limitations of these ethical philosophies make it really hard for us to kind of solely live just with one of these philosophies and abiding by these principles every single day.
Or even set this philosophy as the universal philosophy for across all cultures, across all peoples. And I think that's extremely hard to do.
Like, realistically think about it. In everyday life, would you say you encounter many complex moral dilemmas in terms of relationships, emotions, situational considerations that play a significant role in decision making? That Kantian ethics are too demanding and, in a sense, too specific that it's almost impractical to live by this.
Yeah,
but
of course.
That brings up the idea of moral relativism. That some people may think that it's okay to do that, and it's completely all right. Moral relativism is the acknowledgement of other possibilities. You understand?
Of course. And moral relativism allows us to understand that people can live in a Kantian sense of duty.
Yes, they can.
But you, for instance, could live in a utilitarian sense.
And it's the acceptance of it.
Exactly, and it's the acceptance of it. But there are still limitations. For instance, now that we talked about continuism, let's move on to utilitarianism.
Jinx, you owe me a soda. Anyways, there's also cultural and individual differences with utilitarianism. There's actually a really cool scenario that I kind of want to bring up, that I'll bring up in just 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
So there are different values and beliefs depending on the culture. This can affect what is considered right, quotation, and what is wrong. Utilitarianism may not be able to account these differences and impose a uniform standard of morality that does not reflect the diversity of perspectives. For example, this brings me to my point. In Hinduism, cows are considered sacred, and it's believed that killing or consuming them is a sin. So beef consumption is considered morally wrong.
Right.
But in the context of another staple or another culturally accepted food, you think of burgers and beef. Beef and burgers are a staple food in the Western American culture.
Correct.
And that a nice greasy burger is delicious. So this brings me to my example. So imagine there's 200 people in a room, right?
Mm-hmm.
But 120 people of them are American people who love eating burgers.
Yeah.
But the other 80 are people of the Hindu religion that can't eat burgers because they're not culturally accepted, and that killing a cow is considered
bad,
immoral.
Yeah.
So, in the sense of a utilitarian perspective, wouldn't they argue that because a majority of the people are American, that
because a majority of people are American, then that you would produce the most utility by favoring the majority, and so you would have to feed everyone burgers. But there's a major problem with this, is that it doesn't account for those cultural differences, for those people. For instance, what happens to those 80 people, those 80 Hindus?
It's not fair.
It's not fair. They won't be able to eat the food. But the 120 people may be able to get their food, which is a majority, but those 80 people will suffer. And I think that's a huge limitation to utilitarianism, because it tends to leave a lot of people behind or not account for those left behind, In
a sense, it doesn't, because it doesn't account for this, it ultimately leads to the wrong moral choice. So you're completely ignoring these cultural differences. And this is just one example. And it's the idea of moral relativism. Like, what is right and wrong can depend on factors like culture.
Yeah.
And there's no objective moral truth. In other words, like, what is considered right or wrong can vary from person to person. You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. And, this ties also into the trolley problem. What if there are 3 people on one line and 2 people on another line? According to a utilitarian standpoint, you would favor saving the 3 people, so you would kill the 2 people. But what if the 2 people were pregnant mothers and the 3 people were criminals? These things are really hard to understand, and therefore utilitarianism can make it harder to take into account these cultural differences.
So you talk about how utilitarianism doesn't account for the cultural differences and how that may lead to the wrong moral choice.
Yeah.
But we also forget that utilitarianism is a measure of happiness or pleasure, and that it fails to account for the different weightings of pleasure of each action. And we think how when Bentham and Mill were talking about the quantification and using the qualitative part of measuring happiness, it's difficult to measure happiness and pleasure objectively. People may have different ideas of what constitutes happiness or pleasure, which can make it difficult to determine what is morally right or wrong. An example would be, one person might find happiness in the solitary life of contemplation, while another person might find happiness in the busy social life with many friends. That makes it difficult to determine which weighs more,
Yeah, and utilitarians' emphasis on maximizing this overall happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of people does not necessarily consider the happiness and pleasure of the minority groups. It could lead to a situation where the majority's happiness or pleasure is prioritized while the happiness or pleasure of a minority group is completely neglected.
Yeah, so this kind of just sums up the idea of how, the limitations of these ethical theories make it really difficult to just abide by one in your daily life, especially in your modern daily life as a college student. It opens up to the idea of using a hybrid form.
Or a nuanced approach, right? And this concept just ties into the fact that, maybe there are people that could technically live by a utilitarian standpoint, but 1, it's very difficult, and 2, we can't universalize this due to so many different factors, cultural perspectives, individual perspectives. Because of this lack of universality with these ethical theories, Max and I have a nuanced approach.
Wait, Ryan, do you hear that bell?
Wait, is that joke time?
Philosophy joke, let's get it. So, Ryan, why doesn't Kant lie, cheat, steal, or kill?
I don't know why.
You really don't?
No.
It's because he just can't.
Alright, back to our subject about a nuanced approach. So basically, Max and I are offering a combinational form of utilitarianism and Kantianism and applying it to our own lives and thinking that this could be used by most people. However, we do understand that this cannot be universalized because of the concept of moral relativism, as argued before, but rather we're offering that maybe people can use a combinational form of one ethical theory and another in their own daily lives. Now, in this case, me and Max are going to be using utilitarianism and Kantianism.
An example of this would be Derek Parfit's triple theory. Ryan, I don't know if you've ever heard of the triple theory. Have you?
Yeah, I have.
Good. So it's kind of an example of what we're doing, but just the way we're approaching it. So Derek Parfit's triple theory, also known as the triple-headed theory, is a moral theory that aims to reconcile three traditional moral theories: consequentialism, deontology, and contractualism, and it seeks to combine their strengths while overcoming their respective weaknesses. This is in comparison similar to us, as we're trying to use a hybrid/combinational form of utilitarianism and Kantianism and use the best of both worlds. Parfit's triple theory kind of attempts to find the middle ground among these three moral theories by emphasizing they all contain valuable insights and proposes that moral judgments should consider both the consequences of actions, the importance of moral rules and duties, and the principles that would be agreed upon under fair conditions. Me and Ryan understand that utilitarianism has its pros, has its cons. Same with Kantianism. But we argue that it's almost impossible to solely live just on one. But we understand through the concept of moral relativism that it's understanding that to go through that approach. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and through that approach of moral relativism, we try to diversify our views and take different aspects of different ethical theories. You know, for me, I think that I really enjoy the categorical imperative, right?
Yeah, no, I can say the same thing too.
Exactly. And so, but we also don't like the right to like the lying aspect in Kantianism.
Exactly. So that's the idea of using the beneficial parts and trying to overcome the weaknesses of it and what we think are the weaknesses.
Yeah, exactly. But in utilitarianism, we like to have firm decisions that try to maximize the most utility, but obviously with under certain considerations that we take into account other people. But the whole point of this is we're just offering a nuanced approach, but we still argue and understand that one ethical theory, whether that ethical approach or ethical theory is a combinational form, it cannot be universalized, but rather it's just something that we are offering.
Yeah, so one thing that I want to highlight about using this combinational form is the balancing rights and consequences of these two philosophies. You know, Kantianism emphasizes the importance of respecting individual rights, treating others as an end in themselves. And we agree with that, right? Don't we, Ryan?
Yeah,
but we don't like the lying part. So this is where we're focusing on that part. And while utilitarianism focuses on maximizing overall happiness or utility, we like that idea, but we understand that there's limitations of that. And so by integrating these perspectives, we can strive to strike a balance between considering the rights and dignity of individuals and the overall consequences or well-being of a broader group or society. And this allows for more nuanced evaluation of ethical dilemmas, considering both intrinsic value of individual rights and potential positive or negative outcomes of actions.
Exactly. And now we're going to move on to our interview with Professor E.B., who has worked in the Department of Philosophy at George Washington University for more than a decade. He is definitely an expert in this field, and he's going to give us his take on moral relativism, Kantianism, utilitarianism, and our nuanced approach.
Wait, Ryan, do you hear that bell?
It's joke time!
It is philosophy joke time.
So it's your turn. Let me hear the joke.
Why did the utilitarian refuse to take a stand-up comedy course?
I don't know, Max. Why?
Because he believed that the only measure of a good joke was its ability to maximize overall happiness and reduce suffering. And he didn't want to risk telling a bad joke that would cause harm to his audience's well-being.
That's funny. I like that joke. Alright, let's get into the next section.
Hey guys, my name's Max Chong.
And my name is Ryan Naveed. And welcome to our last section of this show.
So today we have Professor Ebi or Ebi?
Ebi.
Ebi. He's a professor in the Department of Philosophy at GW. He's been teaching here since 2004, if that's correct. And he's joining us on the show, providing his opinions and expertise regarding moral philosophies and moral relativism. So, welcome to our show.
So, to reiterate, we're arguing that moral philosophies like utilitarianism and Kantianism can be applied to modern scenarios, but we also acknowledge the limitations of these philosophies in the context of moral relativism. So our discussion centers around the idea that morality is subjective and dependent on individual perspectives, leading to the recognition that people often navigate different parts of their lives with a variety of philosophies due to the complexity of situations in a daily life. Through examining these concepts, we hope to shed light on the complexity of moral decision-making and the need for a nuanced approach to ethical dilemmas in our modern world.
Yeah, so moral relativism is the central idea behind our podcast. We're kind of hoping to hear your perspective and opinion on the idea of moral relativism and why it's important to consider moral relativism in the discussions of moral philosophies like utilitarianism and Kantianism. So, what's your idea on that?
I have two minds about this question of moral relativism. I think in practice, a certain amount of relativism is necessary. But I also want to hold to the view that there are some moral absolutes or near absolutes. For example, I don't think anybody likes to be lied to.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody wants to be tortured.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody wants to be disrespected. I don't think anybody wants to be stolen from. And so it seems to me that those facts do establish some form of absolute or quasi-absolute for ethical situations.
What do you mean by quasi?
Well,
Semi, okay.
Or seemingly so.
Gotcha.
I think that Kant was on to something important when he said that human beings, qua human, should be treated as ends in themselves and not just as means to an end.
Yeah.
And in that sense, that establishes a kind of absolute point of view.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so are you arguing that mostly Kant's philosophy is grounded and fixed in the reason, basically fundamentally opposed to moral relativism?
I think so. I think Kant would be strongly in favor of a kind of moral absolutism. For example, when he says that lying is always forbidden, even in what he calls a philanthropic reason, still it's wrong. So he's saying that some things are wrong without qualification.
Okay.
And if there are things that are wrong without qualification, then I think those are things that are not morally relativistic. They're non-relevant.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, would you agree with that perspective of Kant?
I don't agree with him about lying, because I think one can think about circumstances in which lying is the right thing to do. Military circumstances, or a circumstance where to preserve public order or goodwill, a public figure lies. I think here the view of Cecil Bach is useful. Cecil Bach wrote the best book I know about lying. It's somewhat old now. It's published in the 1970s, I think 76 or 78. And she says a lot against public figures lying, but in the end, she does admit that there may be cases in which lying is okay. And she gives what I call the Bach test. It's also sometimes called the reasonable man test.
Yeah.
And it's something like this. If you would be willing to have your lie with your name attached to it, publicly shown on TV or displayed, along with your reasons for telling the lie, and if reasonable people would agree to you that lying was the right thing to do in that circumstance, then that could justify the lie.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I actually understand your point about Kant's, you should never lie, but there are cases where you have to lie, and I think that ties into moral relativism in a way, because his ideology of lying cannot be universalized, because there's obviously going to be scenarios that you have to lie.
Well, he thought it could be, and he argues even that, if I understand him correctly, he argues that, contrary to what you said, that the lying can't be universalized.
I meant to never lie should be universalized.
Yes, he says that.
Yeah, he argues that, but I think that's a major flaw, because there's going to be scenarios. For instance, like if a politician is under a scenario where he needs to lie, because if he tells the truth, there'll be riots and more people will get harmed. That's a scenario where I would say it's morally okay to lie. Would you agree?
Yeah, there are moral reasons to lie, I feel like.
Right. But notice that if you do that, then you're siding with utilitarians. And I think the utilitarians were not wrong. In other words, I think that there are circumstances in which the balance of happiness over unhappiness or pleasure over pain, I think those need to be weighed up. And if you can show that the balance is in favor of one side versus the other, I think that's correct. I think, for example, that environmental issues, I think they absolutely, in my view, need to be handled with a kind of utilitarian calculus.
Gotcha.
So I think that there are circumstances in which a calculus of utility does provide the best solution to a problem. I think often public policy problems are handled that way, because with public policy there's almost always going to be disagreements. So what's the best solution? The best solution frequently, I think, is to figure out what will create the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. However, I think that the Kantians are right in that there is a point for treating people as ends in themselves and not as means. And if you treat them as means, then you're offending against their being qua human. So I guess what I'm saying is that neither of these solutions, the ethical relativism or the ethical universalism, I think that neither of those solutions is the whole story.
Okay.
I think there's some kind of tension that inevitably exists between those two. I think also that many of these things are culture dependent and time dependent.
Mm-hmm.
As cultures change, as cultural understandings change, as times and situations change, I think things change.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're also arguing about, how because of different cultures, different perspectives, that's why ethical theories just can't be universalized. So
like, kind of like going back to the idea of moral relativism regarding Kantianism and utilitarianism, what would you say would you say moral relativism has a positive or negative impact on our society? I'm guessing, like, how might the tension between Kant's idea of lying and utilitarianism emphasis on maximizing overall happiness affect the way we think about moral relativism?
Hold on just a minute.
Yeah, of course. Just to simplify that, would you say moral relativism has a positive impact or a negative impact on our society regarding these ethical theories?
I'd say this is a case where both answers are not, I find both answers somewhat unsatisfactory, because I can think of reasons to support both points of view, which means then I guess ultimately I'm a kind of relativist, but I'm a kind of relativist who is uneasy with a too easy or a too simple moral relativism.
Okay.
Because I think, for example, that actions, choices, and so on inevitably have consequences, whether you like it or not. And that you will face those consequences. The old notion of karma, I think, is not wrong here.
Yeah, okay. So, I recently read this book. It's called The End of Reason, a response to New Atheists. That's the book by Ravi Zacharias. He's like a philosopher. And he says this quote, "Moral relativism has steadily eroded the moral foundation of society, reducing morality to personal preferences and the will of individual." To you, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think that that's at least partly right. I think that there were times when people thought they had an absolute answer. The problem with those absolute answers is that they do get eroded over time because they have untoward consequences.
Okay.
So therefore, consequentialism is not wrong. Consequentialism is at least partly correct. In other words, if you're arguing for an absolute which has consequences which are pretty bad, then that tends to show that that absolute is not right.
Could you argue that necessary, in the sense that the erosion of traditional moral values and the rise of moral relativism could be like a positive development? It allows for greater individual autonomy, a more diverse society, and allows opportunity for, critical, ethical self-introspection and kind of the evaluation of
It certainly does all of those things, but it also means that the task of human living is thereby made more difficult. In other words, if you're in a world where there's complete consensus on some moral absolute, then you don't have to think about or deal with challenges to that.
What do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean challenges to that?
Challenges to the moral absolute.
Okay.
But once you admit any challenges to that moral absolute, then your task of coming to a livable ethic is increased. The task becomes more difficult.
Okay. I'm sort of following.
No,
I'm trying to process that.
So do you think it's possible to have a society that's based on universal moral principles, or these cultural and individual differences make it very unlikely?
It makes it very difficult to have those universal principles. Although, as I tried to say earlier, I do think that there are certain things which seem to result in universal principles. When I said nobody wants to be robbed, nobody wants to be disrespected, nobody wants to be lied to, nobody wants to be tortured. Although I suppose you might even be able to find weird cases where people want those things.
Yeah, that's true. There'll always be these places.
But insofar as
So yeah, I guess that's our point. It's just don't you agree, Max? Like also these cultural and individual perspectives will make it nearly impossible to universalize a moral ethical theory promoting moral code.
Basically, what I'm understanding from what you said is I'm pulling up another quote that we both read from Lawrence Michael Hinman, an American philosopher and professor emeritus at UCSD. He says moral relativism can help us recognize and appreciate the diversity of ethical views across different cultures and communities and promote greater tolerance and understanding among people with different moral beliefs. So this idea of moral relativism allows that opening for diversity and allows that opening for, looking at your traditional ethical views. And
Yes, I would agree.
Okay.
But as somebody said, don't have your mind so open that everything falls out.
Okay.
That's a good place. I mean, see, I think that ties into that belief that people often think moral relativism is such a negative thing because there are limitations of ethical theories. But I think this quote, really brings out that it doesn't have to be negative. We just have to understand that people have different moral beliefs.
So you're on the side that it can contribute, moral relativism can contribute to the positive society, and then it also could have negative effects.
Yes, both. Yeah, both of those.
Okay, that's interesting.
Okay, I appreciate your view. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so now do you want to go to the limitations?
Is it okay if we kind of transition towards the limitations of utilitarianism and Kantianism and moral relativism?
All right.
So we talked about this a little bit last week, so we're just going to go over it again. But I remember you talking about how Kantianism or Kant, you align with some of your values with what he says. I was just wondering what ethical theory best suits your day-to-day life. Or if there is one. More relativism.
I think that without being conscious of it, I pull from both of those, or some version of both of those. I mentioned that I have a Kantian sense of duty. Kant said that the one thing that can be said to be good without qualification is duty and a good will. I think that the problem of that is that there are lots of things that people do out of an allegedly goodwill which turn out to be really harmful.
So people do things with the intent of goodwill, but it has the negative effect.
Yes.
Complete opposite.
I think also we are extremely good at confusing and misleading ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, could I just go back a little bit? Could you provide an example of someone who has good intent, but the effect isn't positive? I'm having trouble kind of thinking of something in that case.
Maybe even war. I think war, right? A lot of people have good intentions.
Because Kant's theory is on the idea that intent is a huge factor. You need to have a good moral intent to it.
That's right.
So even if the outcome isn't necessarily positive, would that be going against his ethics?
I
think that would.
The parent who out of good intention demands that the child do X, Y, or Z, and it turns out that doing X, Y, or Z is very harmful, would be a case where a good intent turns out to have a terrible consequence.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
That does make sense.
Sorry. Keep going.
Some people have claimed, I don't know if the claim is true or not, but some people have claimed that the intention of providing public assistance to single mothers has resulted in an increase in single parenthood and fatherless children. So there the intent was to provide economically for single mothers, but the consequence was to produce more fatherless children who turn out to be hellions.
Hellions?
Yeah.
What is that?
A child of hell.
I've never heard of that term.
Interesting.
Well, one example would be an engineering example. Take the development of the atomic bomb.
Yeah, of course. Okay, I think I know where you're going with this.
It was developed in the context of World War II. It was developed by people who were very concerned that the Allies win World War II, and they were very concerned that the Germans not get the bomb, which, under the circumstances, were good intents.
Mm-hmm.
Suppose they were successful in developing the bomb, and they were. was that success ultimately a boon or harm to human civilization? Well, we've been arguing about it ever since.
The atomic bomb?
Mm-hmm.
That's hard. That's very hard. I think...
I think that again ties into morality subjective, right? Because
that does tie into the idea.
some
of
people may
morality
view it
being
moral,
subjective.
some people view it immoral, and we just.
In my opinion, I think the atomic bomb, the pros outweigh its con.
I do too, but that's not a majority view. Many people think otherwise.
Yeah.
Well, in the sense of a utilitarian perspective of, me being an American citizen, I think in our sense that it's a good thing.
As I said, I agree with you, but there are a lot of people in the world who don't.
And
But when we're looking at a utilitarian sense, wouldn't you agree that the majority agree that it's beneficial?
The majority, I don't know what the majority of Americans
I don't
believe
know
in
either,
that,
but
as far as I know, no poll was ever taken of the world's people to find out.
yeah, I think it's just again ties into morality.
And even Oppenheimer himself began worrying about that as soon as he succeeded.
you're talking about the general, right?
No, not Oppenheimer. No, Oppenheimer, the one who's the head of that project.
Of the atomic bomb, right?
Yeah.
Do you have anything?
So, I think because of morality being subjective, just even about this talk, do you think, besides, since we talked about utilitarianism and Kantianism, do you think there are other moral philosophies that may be more effective in navigating moral relativism?
I think it's worth paying attention to Aristotle and Aristotle's ethics.
Virtue ethics, yeah.
Virtue ethics, because Aristotle ties virtue to the development, to the development of the individual, but even more to the development of a society.
Mm-hmm.
So Aristotle ties virtue to what is virtuous for developing a virtuous society, if I understand Aristotle.
Yeah.
And that ties ethics then to what is virtuous for people qua people.
Yeah, no, I agree, but I think that creates a big problem because in different areas, people's virtues may be different among. So I think that adds more to moral. Wouldn't you agree? Like maybe Max's virtues might be centered on honesty, but my virtues could be more centered on something else, for instance. Self-interest, because that could make me a virtuous person. In my belief.
I think that that any reasonable ethics needs to pay attention to self-interest, but I don't think self-interest is the touchstone for moral virtue, because the virtuous person sometimes needs to go against his or her self-interest, I think.
No, that's true. I agree. But I'm just arguing that someone's virtues could be different. Like my virtues are probably different from your virtues. Would you agree? I think we maybe have some overlap of virtues, but if we really get to, like for instance, Aristotle argued about eudaimonia, which is like happiness or welfare, but what determines that specifically?
Well, Aristotle would tie that into being a citizen and being part of what it means to be a member of the polis.
Okay, interesting. I think that just ties, because of the different virtues, it could tie into something called like fluid morality. And I think
so
fluid morality?
I when I was thinking about this thesis, I really thought about the psychology project I did in high school about fluid morality. Do you understand what fluid morality is? It's in a sense the same as moral relativism. Fluid morality kind of refers to the idea that moral values and principles can change over time in different contexts, hence fluid.
Yeah.
So it's just like there's no fixed morality. It honestly depends on the situation or scenario you're in. And so kind of leading to that, I wanted to ask a question. Can an awareness of fluid morality kind of enhance our ability to make ethical decisions and navigate complex moral dilemmas in our modern world?
It might, but it also just might serve to confuse us or to make us unable to make a decision.
How would it confuse us?
Because if everything's up for grabs, then what do you grab onto?
What do you mean everything's up for grabs, though?
It means that there's no fixed point to hang on to.
I think that's a good point, but that doesn't also take away from the fact that we just can't universalize morality, and we have to deal with it,
We can universalize it. The question is whether that universalizing will stand up to scrutiny and whether it will...
yeah, that's the point I was trying to...
And whether it will be necessary to change it over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think maybe...
I think existential threats, for example, tend to narrow the mind and narrow what is possible. You mentioned war earlier. In war, the existential threat becomes overwhelming, or it can become overwhelming.
Okay, that's a good point.
Yeah, kind of, talking or backtracking back to the idea of conscientism and utilitarianism. I'm curious to know what your perspective is on the idea of living in 2023, abiding by Kant's, Bentham, and Mill's philosophies of utilitarianism and conscientism, and kind of the drawbacks of applying these philosophies to modern day life. Because in a sense, I don't see them writing their philosophies 50, 100 plus years ago and kind of predicting how our society would be and if these philosophies would be adaptable.
Well, whatever they predicted or not, I don't know that matters right now. What matters is examining them in light of where we are now and seeing how well they stand up, how well they work. And notice when you say how well they work, you're already
disagreeing that they don't work, agreeing that they don't work.
You're already taking a consequentialist approach.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying in a sense. So
basically, I do understand your point, and just kind of wrapping up, how do you think our understanding of moral decision making and moral relativism might evolve in the future? Because we talked about 2023, but how about in the future? How would moral relativism
do you think these
change?
philosophies are here to last?
Oh, they've lasted this long because there's something to them. If they were obviously false or they were obviously nonsense, they would go away. They're not obviously false. They're not obviously nonsense. They may be limited, but they are onto something important. Consequentialism is important because consequences are important. Kant's mistake was to deny the importance of consequences, or at least not to consider it. Kantianism stays around because the notion of a goodwill and the notion of treating humans qua human as ends in themselves is important.
Okay. So, I don't know, I guess in closing, is there anything you'd like to add or emphasize about the complexity of moral decision making or the limitations of moral philosophy? And I guess
the complexities of moral decision making are with us. To be human is to live in complexity.
That's a good point.
that was deep.
That was a good quote.
So I guess, what are your thoughts on the importance of a nuanced approach to ethical dilemmas in our modern world? Like, I know we talked about last time a hybrid form of opportunism, but you didn't like the word opportunism.
No, I don't like that word.
So
We have situational. So just maybe what we're arguing is a combined form. Rather, maybe one situation I use a consequentialist approach, another one maybe deontology.
and I guess the limitations outweigh the idea of just using a single philosophy.
Well, what did I say? To be human is to live in complexity.
Yep.
To live in complexity is to be faced with differences and to find a way to navigate among those differences or between them in a way which is beneficial to you and to others and to the people around you and to your country and to your world.
That's good.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us for our podcast today.
Thank you
I
so
hope
much.
you appreciated this conversation, and maybe we gave you some information and some perspectives.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, Ryan, that was a really interesting interview. It was awesome.
Yeah, that was.
So we definitely we explored the topics of Kantianism, utilitarianism, and their limitations in the context of moral relativism. And the professor raised some insightful points, challenging and expanding our understanding of these ethical theories. While the interview provided valuable insights, there were also definitely moments of confusion and disagreement.
Yeah, there was. So, like, during the interview, we had a comprehensive discussion about the principles and foundations of Kantianism and utilitarianism. We explored Kantian ethics, which emphasizes the importance of universality, treating individuals as ends in themselves, and following moral duties. And we discovered he aligned a lot of his values with Kantian ethics, which may explain his point of view or his perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I think something that I kind of remember from that interview and I really kind of enjoyed was he specifically did not agree with my idea of food morality, kind of enhancing our abilities to make ethical decisions and navigate complex dilemmas in our modern world. He said that it might just serve to confuse us because if everything's up for grabs, then what can we grab onto? And how there's no fixed point to hang on to. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I also enjoyed his disagreement with our opinion that morality cannot be universalized. And we have to deal with it. You know, he said that we actually can universalize it. However, the question is whether universalizing it will stand up to scrutiny and whether it will be necessary to change it over time. It was a bit confusing because he didn't take a definite stance on it.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, but we do appreciate his analysis and respect it as he is an expert in this field.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate his disagreements because, you know, we're still college students.
Exactly.
And the purpose of these interviews is to learn from these, you know,
Yeah.
masters, experts. But that was awesome. You know, like what I can say that I really enjoyed about that interview specifically, again, was when I asked him about the complexities of moral decision making, he responded that by saying that to be human is to live in complexity, and that to live in complexity is to be faced with differences and find a way to navigate among those differences or between them in a way which is beneficial for us.
Yeah.
Like, that was deep.
That was a pretty good line.
I remember we said, like, whoa, that was deep. Like,
Yeah.
He actually took that to another level.
Yeah, and you know, at the end of the day, we have to respect and accept his opinion, and I think that's what moral relativism actually also teaches us.
That's actually a great point.
Because we need to understand where people come from with different perspectives.
There's no fixed values. There's no fixed perspectives.
Exactly, and I think that's what it taught us. Overall, great interview, great session.
So Ryan, after exploring these different moral philosophies and considering their limitations in the context of moral relativism, and also talking to Professor Ebi, what do you think is the key takeaway for our listeners?
I think the key takeaway is that morality is complex and nuanced, and that there really isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to ethical dilemmas. Instead, we need to take a nuanced approach and consider different perspectives and factors when making these moral decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think it's important to recognize that people often navigate different parts of their lives with different moral philosophies, depending on the situation and context. Exactly why moral relativism is a contributing factor to why a singular philosophy cannot be relied on.
Right, and that's why it's important to approach these conversations with empathy and understanding, even when we don't necessarily agree with someone else's moral perspective.
Exactly, and I also think it's worth noting that these moral philosophies can provide useful frameworks for thinking about ethics. They shouldn't be seen as absolute truths, they're just one way of approaching morality.
Absolutely, and I think the more we engage in these conversations and explore different perspectives, the better equipped we'll be to make ethical decisions in our own lives.
That's a great point. We should approach these conversations with empathy and understanding.
And to keep exploring these ideas would be really good.
Absolutely. I think Professor Ebi's insights about the importance of context and situational factors were really valuable in helping us understand how these moral philosophies could be applied to real-world scenarios.
Yes, and I hope our listeners feel inspired to continue exploring these ideas as well. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you. It's been a great conversation.
Wait, dude, do you hear that bell?
Yeah, I do.
It's joke time. It's our final joke for the podcast. Do you want to say the joke?
Sure. Why did Kant hate eating with others?
I do not know. Why did Kant hate eating with others?
Because he thought that utensils were treating people merely as a means to an end.
All right, that wraps up our podcast. Thank you for listening.
Thank you guys. Hope you guys had a great time.